Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar on fighting for the sustainability of free jazz and Black creative music, understanding how systemic racism has impacted this music. I put this conference together because it's extremely important to me. Over the years, I have been advised to not put my efforts into free jazz because it's not important. But the people who come to the festival and who come to the events think it's very important. The artists' lives depend upon it. But it's also that this music is so powerful. This music in many ways, to me, expresses the cry of the people. And from the beginning of jazz, there has been an effort to appropriate it. And that appropriation has continued into the present in various ways. But I will leave that to the panelists to really illuminate as best we can, because we want to find a way forward. We want to change that trajectory. We are changing it, but we need to make sure that this music is strong and in the community that fostered it. So I will introduce Anthony Jermaine Ross Allam, who will be moderating. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Patricia. I am so excited this afternoon to talk with such a distinguished panel on the topic of how systemic racism and cultural colonization took jazz from Black America. So we'll proceed this way. First, I will read the bios for all of our participants so that they don't have to take time from their content to explain those details. And then afterwards, I will give a short introduction to our conversation and let you know exactly how it is that we will proceed. Nabil Ayers is the general manager of the record label 4AD and also runs his own record label, Valley of Search, where he's released music by Alan Brofman, Cooper Moore, and Patricia Brennan. Nabil has written about race and music for NPR, Pitchfork, and the New York Times. Marcus J. Moore is an award-winning music journalist, editor, curator, pundit, and author of the recently released book, The Butterfly Effect: How Kendrick Lamar Ignited the Soul of Black America, which has been described as the definitive account of Kendrick Lamar's profound impact on a racially fraught America and the rapper's resurrection of jazz. Marcus is also a contributing writer with The Nation and a contributing editor with Bandcamp Daily. His coverage of soul, jazz, hip hop, and rock can be found at the New York Times, Pitchfork, Entertainment Weekly, The Washington Post, NPR, Rolling Stone, and The Atlantic, among other outlets. Lee Mixashawn Rozie has been a practicing multidisciplinary and internationally acclaimed jazz artist for the past 3 decades. Mr. Rozie holds a degree in history and ethnomusicology from Trinity College and is equally at home in academic and cultural settings. Beginning from the point of indigenous artist, Mixashawn has developed the system called hemispheric principles, which uses ancient cultural principles, maritime arts, and historical data, both written and oral, to inform and guide his sonic, aquatic, percussive, and harmonic art form known as wave art. Mixashawn also offers musical performance and educational workshops on contemporary and traditional indigenous music that utilize his extensive experience as performer, indigenous artist, and educator to inspire creativity and natural expression for all ages. His latest album, An American Songbook, is dedicated to the warriors in the Americas who have been fighting against terrorism for the past 500 years. Fay Victor is an improvising vocalist, composer, lyricist, and educator, writing all the chasms and seams of musics that are improvisational and conversational in nature. Victor has released 10 critically acclaimed albums as leader and has worked with a wide range of artists, including Nicole Mitchell, Roswell Rudd, Archie Shepp, Mark Ribot, and Tyshawn Sori. Victor was the 2017 Herb Alpert Yaddo Fellow in Music Composition and a 2018 recipient of a month-long Headland Center for the Arts residency. Victor is currently on the faculty at the New School of Jazz and Contemporary Music, where she gives master classes, workshops, and clinics on creative improvisation and songwriting for improvisers. Victor's work on the recording Harlem Speaks, her contribution to William Parker's album Migration of Silence into and Out of the Tone World, has been called one of the top jazz albums of the last several years. Gargi Shindé is director of grant programs at Chamber Music America, where she leads 7 flagship programs which distribute over $1 million in grants to the small ensemble music field. She is a contributor to Retool, Racial Equity in the Panel Process, a resource to achieve racial equity in the grants review and selection process of artists and arts organizations. For 20 years, Gargi has specialized in arts education, program curation and production, artist development, and digital media. She has traveled the globe appearing on panels and lecturing on performance histories, dismantling institutional bias, strategizing interventions for program transformation, and funding underrepresented aesthetic practices. Her writing has been published in Theater Research International and Arts and International Affairs. So as you can see, we have a very, very diverse panel. And the approach that we'll take for this panel today will be an improvisational approach, since we have a very accomplished and diverse ensemble this afternoon. So we have 3 areas of expertise that I will identify here very broadly. We have panelists who are experts in philanthropy, who know about and who participate in the processes by which artists get the opportunity to create music without having to be worried about keeping body and soul together, rather than dealing with all of the complications of being an artist in this very complex world, especially for people of African descent. We also have expertise available to us today in media. Media, as you know, determines what the so-called general public understands is so-called going on in music. And media has a great deal to do with how we define what it means for art to be Black, who is Black or not Black enough. Or to put it another way, media also determines what is popular, meaning what is valid. And so we're going to talk about what that has to do with white supremacy and taking improvised music, and especially free jazz, from Black America. And of course, we will certainly be talking about artists, because artists are creators. Artists are the ones who join, of course, all of these concerns together, trying to find inspiration and trying to develop the time and the skills that it takes to actually bring their creative processes into the world where they can be shared with audiences, so that generation after generation can build on the creativity that comes from within their culture. As we know, white supremacy complicates all of these things, and the complications of structural racism and cultural colonization have to do with many different areas that our speakers this afternoon will touch on. One area, of course, has to do with gentrification and migration. Neighborhoods, for various reasons that have to do with greed and racism and white supremacy, breaking up and making it difficult for audiences to grow along with geographic areas. And of course, mass incarceration and various aspects of our economic life, whether it's job precarity and other issues, those things complicate who has money to spend on music education, who has the opportunity to perform, and who has the opportunity to even know that people are performing music within their culture and within their tradition. All of these things and more will be on the table as our panelists speak to us about how systemic racism and cultural colonization took jazz from Black America. I'm Jermaine Ross Allam. I am a PhD candidate at United Theological Seminary. I am currently working on a dissertation that is entitled The Social Ecology of Extralegal Violence Against African Americans After Emancipation, which is a winning title that publishers are going to love. But I also research the social ethical implications of creative music with a special emphasis on Anthony Braxton, Wadada Leo Smith, and Nicole Mitchell. So it is wonderful to be here with all of you. And so without further ado, let us begin. I would like to hear first from the philanthropic aspect of our panel. Tell us something about how systemic racism and cultural colonization shows up when it comes to who gets the financial and economic opportunity to make art.
Jermaine, I think you're putting me on the spot here.
Yes. Thank you,
Gargi. Which is a good thing. Please pardon me. I do want to refer to my notes as I speak. It's very, very hard to condense almost 50 years of exclusion in this music in 10 minutes. So I'd like to stay in a coherent fashion. So deep inequity, racial inequity particularly, characterizes the role of roughly 50 years of institutional support in the arts. And when I say institutional supports, I am referring to arts philanthropy predominantly. Marginalization across the intersectional spectrum of identities, of course, race, gender, and ability, is rooted in and is a function of the commodification of culture. So late music historian and critic Robert Palmer, in his 1980 New York Times article, An Overview of Jazz Musicians, observes that jazz's unique encounter with the development of recording technology and distribution makes it subject to corporate ownership in a way that European classical music is not. And you know, it's no secret to our artists and practitioners here that Black art is always pitched against white European, Western European art. And that is really the framework within which we work in arts philanthropy. So in over 40 years since Palmer's article, little has changed in the perception and commodification of jazz music or Black American music or free jazz. It applies to all these art forms as their practice. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has manifested as an accelerant for our collective desire to dismantle the patriarchy when we talk about jazz and gender conversations. So hyper-capitalist ownership, you know, the economic model of digital streaming, but problematically fetishistic visibility, sort of the token equity commitments to programming, you know, Black, Indigenous, and people of color artists in this music. And specifically, we saw the solidarity statements after the murder of George Floyd that flooded our social media platforms. But the collective movement towards change continues to function within half a century old paradigm of art as a transaction between the creator and the consumer. And we have to understand, as we practice art in the United States of America, we are subject to its capitalistic function as well. And I do want to acknowledge, you know, I should have begun with this, but I do want to acknowledge that Arts for Art, and really what Patricia and Mr. Parker have created here stands out as an amazing case study in how it resists. It manages to resist a lot of that. You know, it is an artist-founded organization. It is an entirely artist-run organization, and it is an organization that is sustained by artists, and then also an organization that is focused on Black artists and also artists of color. You know, organizations like this, as Patricia very, very unabashedly pointed out in the beginning, are not supposed to succeed. But yet here you are, you're a global force, you know, and so everything I present here is not a bright idea that we cook up at our office as a funder, but really what we observe on the field and the best practices that we think really ought to inform the entire field as well. And Arts for Arts presents such a marvelous case study for us. We are so proud to be supporting it. They've emerged as consistent grantees for many of their programs, and the Vision Fest this year as well sees David Murray and Andrew Cyril, both CMA commissioned artists who will be performing. So this really, really thrills us. We also take observations from our artistic practitioners on the island of Puerto Rico, and predominantly our Afro-Rican artists who are once again, they have a double, they're sort of subject to a double colonialism. Of course, on the one hand, the United States has an imperial relationship with the island, but on the other hand, also its own colonialist and assimilationist practices on the island. What does it do to this group of Afro-Rican artists who have a double identity of being Latino, but at the same time Black? So we try to understand sustainability practices from these artists as well, and we try to design our function in this field. Now, mind you, we obviously did not function in this manner. We've been around for 43 years, but in 2017, and it took that long, our leadership made an unequivocal commitment to racial equity in the arts, and we started to investigate every single aspect of the organization that holds such a substantial amount of funding for jazz artists, but at the same time, who are we as an organization? What do we project to the artist, and how is it we sustain the artist? So since that time, since 2017, our grant making to Black artists and artists of color has increased to 80% in this program, in this jazz program. It started off prior to that to be under 26%. And when I say artists of color, I want to be very, very clear. When we report these statistics, one can, very happily say, oh, well, 80% of our grantees are now artists of color, but it's meaningless in the art form of jazz, and if we're designed to sustain jazz, if these artists are not predominantly Black, Latino, and Indigenous. So we cannot just use that catch-all phrase, artists of color, and convince ourselves that we are actually making a change. We have to always focus on how this music impacts, how this funding impacts the Black community first, the Indigenous community first, the Latino community first. And this is where, Jermaine, in my email I had mentioned to you, we take the approach of repatriating jazz to Black artists, but fundamentally to Black children in their communities. And also, this is something Arts for Art is, once again, such an exemplar in this. So, we are emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic. We are marked by a civil rights reckoning in contemporary American history. And we are ready to imagine and sustain artistic practice in a post-transactional dynamic. So I want to quote, a favorite cultural theorist, Homi Bhabha. And in the infinite and awesome original repertoire, and I don't just mean the avant-garde as a marketing, tag. I mean, these artists are truly the avant-garde in creativity. So Bhabha says that this kind of an original repertoire remains a persistent intervention in those ideological discourses of modernity that attempt to give hegemonic normality. So we tend to say that something is normal to actually what is the uneven development and the differential, often disadvantaged histories and communities of people. Yet the music's institutional appropriation. So on the one hand, this amazing repertoire and this amazing group of artists are the constant intervention from society's desire to normalize the differential, normalize what is uneven. And at the same time, the music's institutional appropriation by the academy, this is another area we research and observe the field, that less than 10% of faculty members on conservatories and departments of music are Black. Fay, under 3% continue to be are Black women. And Latina women usually are 0. They are absent in these spaces. So, this kind of data gathering has become our work in our commitment to racial equity on the field. So, we talk about the academy. Of course, Mr. Moore, you'll have something to enlighten us about a predominantly white jazz criticism in this space. And patronage, who attends this? So these 3 factors, the academy, white criticism, and predominantly white patronage, have erased the multicultural and syncretic encounters of aesthetic development, which again we see at Vision Fest, we see in the work of Arts for Art. And really, where is the spirituality of jazz, in these mainstream spaces, really? So in order for us to loosen this sort of transactional vise around this music, we have to fortify its community function. And again, this is not any new wisdom. This is everything I've learned from our jazz elders, right? This is exactly what they did. This is exactly how they fostered and their communities. This is exactly how they raised generations of Black musicians and audiences without single dollar of institutional support in this music. This was entirely willed. But this is not a sustainable way, and this is certainly not a moral stance to stand on, especially if you are an institution with jazz funding, right? Or with music funding. It doesn't only have to be jazz funding. How can you morally now justify that there are communities that are not receiving institutional support? So this is something arts funders are sort of confronting at this time. So whether music turns its face towards community as great Black music, it reveals this amazing core of multifaceted and intergenerational artists pursuing extremely sophisticated and complex aesthetic and sociopolitical challenges. At the same time, they're participating in civil rights struggle, investing in the youth development, and fostering future generation of audiences. Where the music fulfills its vision of a cultural commodity as jazz music that we know on this, the touring circuit, on the performing circuit. It reveals very deep intersectional fissures, whether in the form of Melba Liston's violent experiences for transgressing her own place and usurping a man's position on the bandstand, or the conspicuous absence of Black women composers from faculty positions at conservatories and departments, commissions, awards, main stage presentations, record labels, or virtually any manifestation of jazz as a function of the creative economy. Always remember, Black, Indigenous, and Latina women are entirely absent from this. Fortunately, the art form's relatively short history, and despite the pandemic and our fragile yet iconic elders remain with us. And they are a wealth of heritage artists who straddled the dynamic demands of self-expression, shaping the avant-garde of this music, and participating in the community's existential struggles, as well as functioning as professional artists with recording dates, touring, and perhaps the struggle with mental health and police brutality. It is our moral imperative then to bring them with us in this post-pandemic envisioning of how it is we should support this art form. So we can emerge with no more fig leaves, right? We have to expose the existing racially biased frameworks anchored in and veiled by contemporary technological hegemony. More practically, these are now some strategies, of course, and it's, once again, it's the artists who tell us. So I want you all to think about Terence Blanchard for one moment, right? So the Metropolitan Opera's 183-year history has not seen a Black composer. But they'll say, but yes, and we recognize that, and we've commissioned Terence Blanchard. That may be true, but that has not yet happened. And that means in the Metropolitan Opera's 183-year history, there has not been a Black artist supported. So, I play a very tricky role here. I have to be very conscious of the institutional biases we may be complicit in, consciously or unconsciously, I have to be critical of the artists and institutions we support. But there is no space for us to not be open and scrutinize our own systems anymore. We simply cannot emerge in the year 2022, and I say 2022 because our grant cycles are named like that. We receive our own funding in that manner, where we don't support Black artists. This is just not a moral position that is acceptable anymore. And so we have to often investigate, okay, we have, let's say, 350 applicants who apply for funding for only 15 spots. So what are the processes we put in place, right? You all are, as artists, are familiar with panels, the dreaded panel. So, we have to understand how is it we are disseminating this funding. Now, our responsibility becomes to be extremely objective in this, but I would ask you to definitely read George Lewis's excellent little article, I believe he offers 6 steps in decolonizing this process. And he talks about how problematic the notion of meritocracy is as a white concept. Now, this is very, very provocative, this point he makes. And I really do want to take it up, because when we put everybody in the rat race, tell them, go, run, let's see who gets this. We are forgetting that community function that music provides. So when Hurricane Maria hits Puerto Rico, I always ask the question, whose children lose their heritage? White children will always have ballet. There is still not enough space for Black dances. White children will always have classical music. There are Black artists, many of whom we support and many of whom are on our board of directors, but it is still not a heritage Black children take for granted. So whose children lose their heritage? And that question is usually brings up a lot of meaningful answers. So if I may offer some strategies which might be bonkers, or which actually might have some teeth in it, and I want to center myself in this discussion with deep humility, because it is the struggle of Black artists and our panelists, their lived experience that I'm striving to comment on and work on. And also our Indigenous artists, I want to recognize that. But at the same time, my position as a colonial subject myself, somebody having I was born and brought up in India, and understanding, what in our colonial struggle could perhaps offer us strategies to at this moment and this day. So, one of the ways I always talk to artists is I say, okay, what if artists of color filed a class action lawsuit against all the arts institutions of the United States? It may be just a symbolic one. It may be for damages for $1, but I can guarantee you, if you look at labor practices, there'll be a lot more than $1 that could be awarded in damages. Because what we're talking about fundamentally is cultural rights are a human right. This is an accepted idea. It's also a clause in the United Nations, idea of human rights. The treaties on human rights. So when Black children, for example, are defunded for the past 50 years from practicing their cultural heritage, or Black audiences are prevented from enjoying their culture and identifying with their culture, and that identification process that takes place in culture, we are denying them a fundamental human right. So, this, of course, goes hand in hand with the denial of other human rights to the Black community. So this is one. So, what if we took it? What if we challenged this idea in the court of law? The United States is everything is so much about settlements and damages paid out that we forget that the court systems are also a space to develop a precedent of behavior, of practices. So what if we said, let's take the wealthiest. I'm going to get in trouble for this. Well, let's take the wealthiest institutions in the United States. And you can go to guidestar.com and you can see what their tax returns are. And what if we did a class action lawsuit? We need only 5 artists to start a class action lawsuit. I'm pretty sure we'll find more than 5. So that's one. That's one strategy to really challenge what equal rights, equal practice, labor hire, because you are all, creative, this is your creative labor and you get compensated for it. So if we prevented Black teachers from teaching in white schools, that would be a civil rights case immediately. Why is it that we accept Black artists in this way, not being seen in these prominent, well-paying, spaces? So that's one idea I talk about. So, but the mere specter of a civil rights action looming over arts, it unfortunately betrays its decaying values and redundant processes, right? Because we're still in that transactional idea of art being created and art being consumed. So the motivation for rebirth is potent. And if you would sue a big tech company over your digital streaming rights, why wouldn't you challenge real stages in the court of law, right? This is a similar idea. And so we're trying to understand where the rebirth is. And here are some points, and I will conclude on this. This is a newer way that we as funders are talking about supporting artists. We're keeping heritage artists at the center of funding. And Jermaine, again, the question you asked is who gets to create in an unencumbered manner with a patron? Classical music has a 400-year, it goes all the way back to the Greeks, but 400-year sort of independent patronage system. Jazz, it starts only in the late 80s. So think about that disparity to begin with, right? So keeping heritage artists at the center, Patricia is absolutely right. What we sense is an arrogance that comes out of conservatory programs that hey, I spent $70,000 getting this degree. Why shouldn't I be awarded this grant? So, you have to be careful. And I always quote Luke Stewart, the bassist, who really said something wonderful once. He gave us that moment to think about that. To access a heritage icon artist as your mentor, you now have to go into debt to do that, when once upon a time they were part of the local community, right? So because a lot of them are now in the conservatory system, and to access their teaching and their wisdom, you have to go into debt as a student. And Luke might have inspired the way we designed Performance Plus, our program for women leaders, where we acknowledged that women were not accepted as apprentices by a lot of our male artists who were touring and had a lot of success at the time. So it gives them the opportunity to work alongside a veteran, iconic artist of their choice. And we underwrite the cost of paying the artist and also the cost of paying it. And so uncovering the lost, the second point is uncovering the lost generation of women in jazz. This is a certain generation. These women practitioners are now in their late 50s and late 60s who have never been supported institutionally. So uncovering that, understanding how we need to support them. Fortifying local and regional advocacy, meaning organizations that are in their own communities. And of course, I do want to point out as an example, East Side Arts Alliance, run by Elena Serrano out in Oakland. She has very, very close ties with David Murray and has supported a lot of his works and really practices the Bandung spirit of community work through celebration of jazz. And they also do the Malcolm X Jazz Festival. And also civil rights, protecting their civil rights. Diversifying field coverage, of course, I'll defer to Mr. Moore over this. We want to see more Black writers, more Black reporters covering this music. Finding unique opportunities. This is one where I say that this is one example I give where we recently supported a Navajo artist, Delbert Anderson. He is a trumpeter in the New Mexico community, and there are about, it's one of the richest regions for Native communities. And Delbert works, he's a jazz practitioner, and he uses the principles of this liberation music as a model for the youth on the Navajo reservation, among who he reports a very high suicide rate. So Delbert works with them. And so we are trying to understand this is a unique opportunity. This kind of an effort in the community must be fostered, must be invested in. And also, lastly, fostering future audiences. And as I've mentioned, bringing the music back to the community. And one great example I always like to share is by one of our own family members, Andrew Cyril, who used to play with Don Pullen in Long Island. As young men, they were in their 20s. And their predominant audience base used to be Black women who would work as housekeepers in those mansions there. They would relax on a, I believe he said on a Sunday, and Don Pullen and Andrew Cyril would just play for them. So you know, why do we value an audience that can afford a $120 ticket, but perhaps has absolutely no investment in the artists and no investment in the music over a demographic like this that Don Pullen and Andrew Cyril played for in their formative years as artists? So we're trying to understand, you know, which audiences have, once again, not been supported, not been fostered. Once again, my challenge, and I apologize to the panel, is always to condense our work in a very short time. I'll pause here and defer to Jermaine.
Gargi, we thank you so much for giving us that overview of your work and the priorities that you've taken. And I'm so happy that you brought to the forefront this imbalance of patronage, which is a very tricky word. But if we're dealing with art and not something that is not art, as you said, it's very necessary for there to be sources of funding to support the artist so that the artist can be the artist and connect in an authentic way and produce something that moves a tradition forward in creative and risky ways. And so we thank you for your work, but we thank you for just getting us started so that we can understand that there is more to art than just inspiration and then living on air after the fact. I'm particularly grateful for this word that you use, repatriation. And when you say repatriation, I think you really help us to understand what you also said, which was heritage. The arts sometimes can be treated like something frivolous or something that is extra or above and beyond, but it is very much a source of life, especially for our artists. And this idea that you should, as a culture, that one should own that and that one should be jealous of it and take it back when it's being taken from you is something that we often don't hear when it comes to music, you know, as if it's some sort of luxury that is there for all lives. I'll put it that way. Certainly music is for everyone, but everyone should also claim the right to their heritage. And so I appreciate that language of repatriation. Before we sort of transition into talking about those individuals who are part of setting the master narrative to talk about repatriation, that is, before we start talking about music journalism in connection with what you've offered. Do any of our panelists have anything that you would like to raise as a question to Gargi to follow up with what she's offered?
I'll break the silence by just saying I thought that was amazing. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes, it was. The one thing I just wanted to say, what Gargi reminded me of, which is a word that I've been thinking about a lot during the pandemic, is infrastructure. Who has it and who doesn't have it? So I thought that was a great foundational explanation, Gargi, about who has it and it was just a deep explanation. So thank you.
Yes, thank you again, Gargi, for that wonderful contribution. So I'd like to shift our conversation just a little bit, but in the knowledge that whenever something in our conversation connects with what's gone before, any of our panelists, please feel free to pick it back up and combine it with what you have to say. But when we talk about heritage and the right to own one's heritage and to make a contribution to it, we can't, of course, ignore the role of journalists and media more broadly, because most people receive knowledge about music from journalists or from those musicians whose music has come to the forefront as a result of media selecting by various means who gets to come to public attention. And so I wanted to begin with a question that was raised by Nabil earlier. He wanted to know, as a person who owns a record label and also as a writer for many outlets, why is it important that Black people are involved in the teaching, nurturing, booking, recording, releasing, and especially reviewing of jazz and creative music? Why is that? So Nabil, if you would speak to that question, tell us why that question is important to you and what sort of answers have you begun to form around that?
Sure. Yeah, I can try to answer my own question. I don't fully have an answer to it, but maybe other people do. But to back up a little bit, I mean, in your intro, which is great, you talk about white supremacy, which I think we all know by now often means not the deliberate, but the systemic, the things that just naturally exist and every day and go noticed, and the things people don't think about. And so many of those things are related to access and structure. And jazz, I think in particular, is obviously a Black American art form. And for that reason, it's important that Black people remain involved. And that's absolutely not to say that white people or anybody else shouldn't also be involved. It doesn't need to be completely limited to Black people, but Black people need to be part of it and part of the message and part of how it gets out there. And I think there are all these stages from the very beginning to the very end where I have this huge list here I'm going to look at, but the way kids are taught jazz or any music in school in America, it's most likely from a white teacher. If people get lucky enough to the point where they're performing live, it's likely booked by white people at a venue or a festival or someplace like that. If they're lucky enough to make an album, it's often recorded by a white engineer, a white producer, or a studio owner. And this goes and goes and goes. Certainly white-owned record companies, the people who direct and shoot music videos and live performances, many of the writers who write about it, who do so for white-owned publications. Lucky enough to get on the radio, very likely going to be a white-owned radio station, very likely going to be a white DJ. The record's very likely going to be bought in a record store owned by a white person. At every stage in the game, that's what exists. And I think the easy way to look at it is, well, that's just what exists. And that person started their studio or that person started their record store. And of course, that's true, but that's the systemic piece that we're talking about. So, I think it's really important to get Black people involved at every stage in the game. And this isn't just about musicianship. This is about the people who do all those things I just went over. And, I have some potential solutions, which are very simple, but there's some amazing things happening out there right now. And obviously everything Gargi just talked about, I thought was incredible. And, funneling resources directly to Black and Latino and Indigenous artists and building that network is a huge place to start. But there are some organizations that are really working towards that equity. There's an organization called the Harmony Project in Los Angeles and Compton. I'm not sure if you guys know about it, but they do a lot to teach kids production work, and they have studios there and they teach them how to run a studio and how to engineer. And it's not so much about being a musician, but it's about that end of the business, which is extremely white and doesn't need to be, but we need people like them doing things like that. There's a Color of Music collective who offers internships for children of color and kids of color. And they do incredible things. And that's a great way to sort of funnel a more diverse pack of people into record companies and into that end of the business. There's the Black Artist Database, which are these incredible people, I think based in London and Berlin, but it's a website, so it's obviously international. And it's just this humongous, largely crowdsourced list of Black creators in every field, from video directors to recording engineers to musicians. It's really this huge, I think there are several thousand people that exist on it. It's a really easy website to use. So, and I hope and imagine that there are a lot more things like that going on that I'm unaware of. And so I think it's not the solution, but a step towards equity is supporting these people in these places that are working towards it. And, and really thinking about every step in the game. I mean, I just mentioned many and it felt like a lot, but there are certainly more steps than that. And just thinking about who's involved in every piece of the process and how to make it more equitable.
Thank you so much. And when you mention all of these different pieces, Nabil, do you get the sense that consumers of music media are aware of all of the different pieces that are in place in order to deliver
the
latest review?
Of course not. And they don't necessarily need to be, you know, I obviously run a company and I'm very aware of every one of these little steps, but what if I buy a sandwich, I probably think less about every little step, as an example. You know, that's not my business, so I don't think about it. And I think that's how a lot of people are about music. The artist makes it and I hear about it and I get it, right? And that's it. But of course, there are so many people, even on the most basic self-released artist album, even on that scale, there can still be a lot of people involved.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Before we transition to hear from Marcus, I had just one more question for you. And anyone, of course, can chime in on this. But I'm curious, as a writer, you know, writing about music for various publications, how is it that you perceive of opportunities available to music journalists to actually fight against systemic racism and to fight against cultural colonization by not only writing about a wide variety of Black musicians, but also like adjusting the way writing is done, the form that writing takes?
That's a hard one for me to answer on a larger scale. I can certainly answer as it applies to me personally. I've written a fair number of articles and I'm working on my memoir. I mean, the way that I've sort of dealt with that, as you know, I'm lucky because I'm not a writer for a living. We're about to hear from a very accomplished one after me. But so, you know, the things I write about, I'm really able to sort of choose. So I was able to review the Bad Brains album, Eye Against Eye, for Pitchfork, for a big music website. And that was really exciting to me because to me, that wasn't about a Black person reviewing a Black record for a website. That was me talking about an album that I love. And in a way, I think that can be, I don't know, maybe it was less heavy-handed than if I'd thought about it going the other way. Well, people just got to read about this album and it wasn't necessarily about race, although of course it contained a lot about it because it's impossible to talk about that album without talking about it. So that's the way that I've chosen to deal with it, is I just write about the things that interest me and that I like. And I think that just sort of becomes part of it naturally.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, I think people underestimate how important it is not only to write about what you love, but to write about things as if you actually love it. And I remember Anthony Braxton is among many creative musicians who have always complained that among all the things that go into the making of music, journalists very rarely ask questions that pertain directly to like the full breadth of what goes into making a piece of music, whether it's about something that has to do with spirituality, or politics, or an ancestral practice. There's so much that goes into Black music that if more Black people had an opportunity, I think, to hear what is actually going into the creation of the music, it may change people's attitudes toward music that might at first be a little bit off-putting or maybe sound strange. And so I think what you're saying about love is really important. Help other people love the music by actually drawing out, even in conversations with artists, what do they love about making their music? And what is it about what they love in the world that shows up in their music? And then put that on the printed page so that people who may not like the sound immediately will be drawn into a discovery process. And I think that's a part of white supremacy, unfortunately, is that no one is thinking about how to make the writing about the music attractive to people who have an ancestral interest in, this music. But thank you for giving us that to think about.
Thank you.
At the beginning of your book, Marcus, I found it very interesting how you began your book about Kendrick Lamar, which is the butterfly effect, how Kendrick Lamar ignited the soul of Black America. And you say Kendrick wasn't some sort of prodigy. He didn't descend from his bassinet with a microphone and a composition book. Instead, he simply found something he loved and stuck with it. So could you tell us a little bit about how you understand the role of the writer writing about Black music, having a love for it, sticking with it, and also contributing to what makes others stick with it, and maybe even discuss some of the forces within the publishing world and the journalism world that might get in the way of doing just that?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up that last point, especially because it's been something I've been wrestling with, at least for the past couple of years, where, from the outside looking in, before you start writing a book or before you write a book of this magnitude, there's this assumption that, okay, clearly everybody's going to know and love Kendrick Lamar. Clearly everybody's going to want to read a book about Pharoah Sanders or Alice Coltrane or all of these other people who I'm walking around or I'm driving around. I love their music. But you learn quickly in book publishing that besides the big names, they're not really interested in books about people who folks ought to know about, you know? So for instance, my second book that I'm working on now is about De La Soul. So if you're in hip hop, if you followed hip hop or the culture, you just know De La Soul and you know that they're legends. But it's almost kind of alarming when you pitch it to certain publishers and they're just kind of staring at you with this blank face, like, yeah, who's that? I have no idea who that is. So I say that to say that it can be challenging because, you know, it wasn't difficult to pull a Kendrick Lamar book together or to get that idea together because we were sort of unfolding Black history as it happens. But, you know, the next book that I wanted to do was on Pharoah Sanders, and it was this sort of blank slate, you know, these blank looks that I would get. But I think it's important in writing about Black music too. Like you just said something that really stuck with me where, you know, there's this sort of, when people are thinking about Black music for whatever reason, when they're thinking about, you know, something that's challenging, you know, whether it's free jazz or avant-garde or what have you, they sort of see it as this thing, you know, that they can't wrap their arms around, so they don't try. But it's widely accepted that, okay, this, you know, quote unquote white band, this white act, we can understand that because that's just part of the culture. Oh, clearly everybody knows Springsteen and Dylan and, you know, we just know that, you know, but no one wants to take the time to understand, you know, Ornette Coleman or people like that. And it's frustrating, but it makes me understand that at least in music journalism and book publishing, there's still this sort of widespread narrative that they only want to know about the surface of the Black music, or of the music rather. They don't want to know about what goes into it, like you said in your question, where, you know, by and large, I've learned that people just want to be entertained by Black music, but they don't want to know about the sort of trauma, or they don't want to know about the complexities that go into the music. And so the reason why I started the Kendrick Lamar book that way is to just show, you know, if you go on social media, you type in Kendrick Lamar, he's sort of held up as this, you know, mythical figure. But I wanted to break down those silos and just let people know that, hey, he's worthy of praise, but at the same time, he's just a guy who works really hard at what he does, and he really is serious about his craft. So if anything else, it was me writing to Black children to say, you too can be Kendrick. You know, that's my main thing. Like, I'm glad that people are liking the book now, but I was more so writing it for 10 years and 20 years from now, where let's just say the next Kendrick Lamar is somewhere in his house or his basement, and he's trying to figure out what he's going to do, what he or she is going to write. And, you know, just start. You know, the most important thing is just to start the process and keep going. So I wanted to break down the challenges of his music just by showing that he had to work towards that. He didn't start by, you know, his first few mixtapes were not overly challenging, but he worked towards that point. And at the same time, he, you know, kept at it and worked and made this very challenging music.
Excellent, thank you. I'm happy that you are emphasizing challenge and work. And I think that underscores so much of what Gargi was explaining to us. Like, this is work, you know, it's labor, and it's challenging for the artist, and it requires support on so many different levels just to create a context where somebody can confidently and successfully work and labor. And for you, you know, Nabil and Marcus, you know, both of you understand that the journalist's role often has been, just as you said, to keep a pretty superficial level of analysis on Black American music, which is to say this music is about feeling something. It's not necessarily about thinking about something or realizing something or struggling through the familiar and breaking through to like a new familiarity, which is impoverishing, you know, for Black art, as it would be for any form of art, to be simply reduced to like the surface level of entertainment. Not that entertainment is bad, and not that we don't need entertainment, but the journalist role seems to be very key in training people how to listen. And we, of course, don't want the journalist to try to determine how the music is perceived. But I think, especially those of us who have studied a little bit of classical music, you realize that you can read the work of a critic and understand that, oh, I judge this too quickly, right? Like, let me go listen to that again now that I understand something about the harmonic structure. Or even reading art criticism or any form of solid criticism, you realize that, yes, with something that's entertaining, you can figure out pretty quickly, does that entertain me or not? If it doesn't, move on. It's just entertainment. But in the world of art, oftentimes, as Nicole Mitchell, teaches us, that you have to actually encounter that line between the familiar and the unfamiliar, that which repulses you and that which draws you in, because it gives you an opportunity to figure out something about yourself and to actually be able to transcend your own boundaries. And so an artist, of course, has to be able to do that for herself and for himself. But then you have to have some kind of support so that you can actually take those risks and see them through, fail, try again, and take on all of the emotional risk that requires, and then look forward to say, okay, I've got the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years on my artistic journey. I can figure that out. I can figure out my place within a tradition. And so I think we have to emphasize that journalists and other people who write about Black music have something of an uphill battle, because a lot of folks want to reduce Black music to easy pleasure of all sorts and just mere entertainment. It shouldn't make me think too much. And if it does, then maybe that artist is trying to be something that they're not. And so I applaud both you, of course, and Nabil for your work, and encourage you to continue to find ways to help people love the music just as much as the artists love the opportunity that they have to create for a living. At the same time, however, now, of course, we're prepared to talk to our artists. And I don't mean that to suggest that no one we've talked to up until now is an artist, but Mixashawn and Fay Victor, of course, know what it is to create art because they've dedicated decades of their life to this creative process. And so, Mixashawn, I wanted to ask you, if we could begin with Mixashawn, or not even a question, but I wanted to ask you, could you tell us something about the process of realizing, on one hand, that systemic racism and cultural colonization is real, but that you have something to bring into the world that you have to fight against? What was it like for you as an artist realizing that there is this thing, racism and cultural colonization? It's a challenge, but I'm not going to let it get in the way because I have something to create. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah. It's interesting because being indigenous from this part of the continent here in the East, we don't really have as much of a ancient cultural base to draw on as many indigenous artists further west do, because we've been here pretty much since the inception of colonialism here in the United States. So as an indigenous person, learning my craft and being involved in music, the idea of white supremacy is just so ingrained in you that oftentimes you don't realize the everyday things that just come into contact with that influence you. I'll give you an example. When I was in elementary school, I'll never forget. I think it was like fifth or sixth grade, and the teacher every afternoon would read us excerpts from two of the novels by Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. And I always remember every time they would talk about Engine Joe, I would just be cringing. And then in the next breath, they talk about the nigger Jim. And I'm bringing this up because right from my childhood, I was really constantly bombarded by that so-called duality of who I am, because I'm of indigenous descent. I'm also of Black descent. I'm also of Asian descent. But the thing that really struck me is that in looking back on it, is that those everyday markers that, you know, we hold up as culture, as we just take them as being for granted, that it's something that we have to well, not even endure, but just really ingrain in our brain these constant reminders of that we're less than. I mean, I live in a city, as you know, like most cities in the United States, in Hartford, they call it a minority majority city. And this is something that's thrown around every day, just like many people of color will often refer themselves as a minority. This is even in taking that thought into your head, it's an oxymoron, because it doesn't make any sense. We have to be called a minority, meaning less than. And even when we're in the majority, we can't even claim the majority. We're still the minority, but they have to acknowledge, well, yeah, there's too many of you, so we have to call you a minority majority. So as an artist, as an indigenous artist coming up, you know, that specter of white supremacy is always looming in there. And part of how that breaks down also is how, you know, your own brothers and sisters. I'll give you an example. Like when I came up with the name Afro-Algonquin back in the 70s and put an album out, Afro-Algonquin, people loved it in Germany, but here in the United States, there were people who liked it, but I can't even tell you how many Black people, how many Native people came up to me and said, what are you talking about? These two musics have nothing to do with each other. And at a very young age, because the household I grew up from when I was an infant, my mother's mother, my grandmother, would always sing to me in indigenous songs and be telling me stories, but never really being political about it. And as I grew up listening to the music that was played in my house, we used to play everything from Stravinsky to James Brown to tribal music from all over the world. So I never really made a distinction about, you know, what kind of music is supposed to be what kind of music. Because to me, I was always a person, and the way I was raised up, always a person just accepting those influences that really appeal to you, and just incorporating it to what I do. Now, being of indigenous descent and growing up in the homeland of, you know, my father, in the Quanatuckwa River Valley, also known as Connecticut, you know, I grew up on the river. So I was always taking in cultural influences, but to me, listening to the birds sing, watching the patterns of nature, that was, to me, those were cultural patterns that I paid just as much attention to and gave just as much importance to as human cultural experience. And even getting to, you know, with Black music, for instance, like, you know, great Black music, that is something. Look at some of the great, as we identify them as Black. Charlie Parker, for instance, who was of Cherokee descent. Jimi Hendrix, also of Cherokee descent. Charlie Mingus, you know, Oscar Pettiford, Don Quillen, who I had a chance to play with, and we would talk about this kind of stuff. We had to play with him. But the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, even identifying the music can be so confusing because we're constantly bombarded by negative things like white supremacy. Yet at the same time, in guarding our own cultural heritage, oftentimes we'll take on the role of the oppressor and project it on those around us who we don't feel are towing the party line. For instance, who is appropriating Black culture? Look at Bruno Mars, how they come down on Bruno Mars. Oh, he's appropriating Black culture. Oh, please. Bruno Mars, I never even thought of him as white even for a second. So, I mean, it's like, but even having that discussion that it's out there shows you like how we're fractured. And with my art, I've always tried to, and I don't want to sound like, I'm one of these people. So, we're going to blend everything together and it's going to be a giant Oreo cookie and it'll be better. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is just identifying who you are and how your music relates into that whole picture. So if that's because everybody had such interesting things to say. I mean, I've been playing this music for like good 40 years, and I've had a chance to play with most of the people, like everyone, Charlie Mingus, Don Pullen, Sam Rivers, many people. And in doing that, I've always tried to just be my own voice. So if that's answered the question, I hope so.
No, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head and then some. We appreciate it. Your comments, reminded me of a conversation with James Brandon Lewis, where he talked about the work it takes to figure out who you are is real work, and that musicians who have an opportunity to develop their art over a period of time have a chance, to put those fragments that you mentioned together. Not that those fragments ever stop being, distinguishable pieces, but you work at your own integrity on your own terms. And I think people need more opportunities to hear from creative Black artists. What does identity look like? Not as you responding to something that someone's doing to you, but you responding to the opportunity to be yourself and to develop yourself in sound and in other forms. And I think, as we think of our journalists, that's part of the challenge that journalists face writing about Black music, is how do you sort of shut off of, the external conversation about this is who you're supposed to be, this is the marketable version of your authenticity, versus what's the real ongoing work right now of you building your own integrity and putting in the artistic work to do it against anyone who wants to tell you for you who you are. And so, as we shift the conversation in Sister Fay Victor's direction, I have to say, more than any other vocalist recently, listening, to Fay's multiple ways of approaching the voice has challenged my conception of what it actually means to listen and to hear. I remember distinctly, I think it's a track called Otherness on Nicole Mitchell's album Maroon Cloud. And I remember writing about that, the vocal performance and its relationship to other instruments. And I realized I have absolutely no idea how to write about what I'm hearing, because I've never really paid attention to what it feels like to hear somebody use a human voice in a way that is unfamiliar to me, but very intriguing. And I was also writing a comprehensive exam for a PhD program. And so I realized, okay, I need to write this coherently, but I need to write this in an honest way. And so, as a vocalist, I have to say, even as a listener, it's very interesting to think about what does an artist draw out of you as a listener. And it actually makes me as a listener find a new approach to language and give myself permission to be vulnerable, even trying to say something like, what do I think beyond music theory is happening in this line? What might it mean to me in addition to what the artist is trying to say? And so, Fay, I know that you have enormous experience in music, both as an educator and as a performer and as a composer. Could you tell us a little bit about some of your process of determining for yourself what it means for you to develop what is in you? And tell us about any challenges that you have faced, perhaps from systemic racism or cultural colonization along your path to being yourself.
Oh, wow. I think I've been really fortunate in the sense that I come from a family and a background that has been sort of unapologetically Black, and my family is from the Caribbean and South America. And I've spent a lot of time in the Caribbean, especially as a child, in Trinidad and Tobago, Trinidad specifically, and I talk about it a lot because it really informed my perspective as a Black person, as a Black woman, because it was a predominantly Black space. I mean, it's a very multicultural space, but it's a predominantly Black space. And certainly at that time, the Black narrative ran everything. And it's also a very proud Black space, I'll just add to that. So just sort of interacting with that, and then sort of living here. I was born in New York City, and moving back and forth and going to school in both places for a while, and sort of just sort of interpreting those differences. I was just raised to be very proud of who I was. And fortunately, what that did for me was when I came into this music, which was in the sort of early '90s, when jazz was a very, very male space, and it gave me a certain type of confidence to interact and feel. I mean, not as an equal, because I was, I was old school. I learned on the bandstand. That came up earlier. I learned on the bandstand. I learned out of the Black space, this music also in the beginning. Actually, I started out in the workshop that was run by Julius Eastman's brother, Jerry Eastman. So that's just where I started. And they were really, Jerry Eastman and an organist and pianist by the name of Jimmy Siegler out of Philadelphia. And again, a really proudly Black space. And there was a real community around this music. They were more mainstream, and I sort of went on to sort of go on from that. But I'm really happy for those experiences, because they kind of laid the foundation for me to kind of just be who I am and still claim it as Black. And something I say a lot, like the Black experience is vast. And so when I'm put into a box, I really fight out of that box, because it's vast. I mean, and because so many Black people have so many different interactions, it's really not fair to say what is definitely Black or not. So if I can share something that was really interesting, you asked me about my vocal. So I call myself a sound artist. Like I'm a vocalist, but now I kind of say that I use my voice as my voice is just an instrument that I do all that I do. And I really need to make that distinction, because sometimes the word singer and vocalist can feel a little reductive. But I had a recent, and part of my vocal language comes out of the singer Kathy Berberian, who is not Black. I wouldn't argue, I don't know if she's white either, because she was from Azerbaijan. But she did a piece that was written by an Italian composer. And anyway, I was in a master class a few months ago, and the master class was about African American music, and he invited me to talk about my vocal practice. And so I brought up that this was an aspect of my vocal practice, and it's a fundamental aspect. I cannot leave this detail out just because she doesn't happen to be conveniently Black. And so he sort of stopped me, and he said that, we're talking about Black musicians in this space, and maybe this is not the best time, maybe to kind of, maybe I shouldn't talk about it. And I said, well, I think it's even more important to talk about it, because as a Black person, to have the agency to feel that it's absolutely okay to reference a piece of modern classical music and use it, not honor, not sort of revere it. I mean, it's a great piece, but to sort of see it as a source of inspiration for my vocal improvisational language. I think that's really important for any Black person to feel they can do. And so I felt it was important to say it like that, and that's how I explained it in the class. It's about the idea of taking agency and taking control and ownership over your artistry, and that the influences of that artistry may come from many different places, and to stay open to what that might be.
I'm so glad that you brought that out, because I think a key problem, even as we're talking about Black art and great Black music, it's easy to forget that those musicians that we are referring to were doing great Black music, not just because their music was only drawn from people who had the same skin color, but it was precisely because they decide the terms upon which they will engage various influences. And so I'm really glad that you brought that out, because, and I think some of our, musicians in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s took a hit from the press if they drew influence from, from Carnatic music or from Wagner. God bless Wagner, but Wagner can apparently inspire a wide range of people. But there was this sense in which, I'm using Anthony Braxton's term now, this across the tracks syndrome, that a certain group of people, we come over to where you are because we want to see you sweat and help us get in touch with our animalistic side. And if you, as a Black artist, are drawing influences according to your own agenda, then you're trying to be white. And
yes, exactly. And I'd like to, because I've had that been, also in the idea of the kind of musicians that I work with, I'll just say that I'm a musician because I started as a musician because music sort of saved my life, in the sense that, and I don't want to go into, but it really did. And one of the big decisions, one of the things I saw is that it's actually the guiding factor. So I don't guide it; it guides me. And so if I feel compelled in a certain direction, I go in that direction. And it doesn't, and I try to be, respectful. For example, when I lived in the Netherlands for a long time, and I used to get, at a certain point, after a number of years of living there, I sang some material in Dutch. And Dutch people said something about that. They're like, why are you singing in Dutch? Why would you want to sing in Dutch? And I'm like, well, you've been singing jazz music in English, terribly, by the way. So why isn't it okay for me to sing in Dutch? And also, I've been living here now some years. So singing or interacting in that culture, I'm now part of this culture. It's not my culture, but I've lived here long enough that I feel okay to sort of make a statement around it. So I had to actually fight about that, yeah. But that's also my point. I feel like it's okay to fight about that and to stand up for what you're trying to do. And so when we talk about this idea of white hegemony, because that's the term I prefer to use, of course it exists. I know it exists, but I always felt like I can't let my life be defined by it. As much as I can control that, I cannot let my life be defined and my artistic practice be defined by it. And I'm not for money. I moved to Europe with literally like under $5,000. It was a risk, but I knew it just felt like it was the right thing to do. And it was a gamble that paid off. And it's also something I like to talk about, like make it just this normal thing, like get out and travel, get out and see the world, get out and have other perspectives, get out and make music with other cultures, and just get other perspectives, because that will also influence your art. And it'll also, I think, make you stand deeper in your own truth.
That's beautiful. What I'm hearing from both you and from Mixashawn is that this tradition is not about reifying the concept of race at all, but it is about heritage. And, as Gargi told us, this word repatriation and heritage is really important, because there's no music on the planet and no art on the planet that is just an isolated phenomena of one group of people. But art is always a history of interconnection. And you use the word agency, Fay, which I think is super important for us to realize that, again, an artist is someone who is giving the world a vision of what agency and power or even sovereignty looks like. It's not sovereignty against or over other people, but it's actually taking the opportunity to be alive and figuring out what that means for you to do that as yourself. And an artist is one who gives us some, physical, whether it's auditory or visual, some representation of what the reality of freedom looks like. And if someone is only operating within the perspective of, oh, Black has to be just these things that, by the way, white people said was Black. Another ethicist, Victor Anderson, refers to, the Blackness whiteness created. And too many of our musicians and too many of our journalists, unfortunately, write from the perspective of you're sort of pushing a concept of Blackness rather than giving people the space necessary to give Black life broader and broader and broader parameters and a deeper and deeper well to draw from. So I really, thank you for sharing that experience with us. So we have, let's see, about 10 minutes before we start our Q&A at 4:30. And so by way of improvisation, you have all listened to what each other has to say about philanthropy, about creative activity and personal formation and journalism, and the difficulty of writing as a way of preserving this music. And now I would like to hear what is in the mix. What is it that you have heard from another one of your panelists that you would like to pick up and run with for a moment? I can pick someone, but that would not be as creative as we could be, because I want to hear what's organically bubbling up from within the group.
May I, Jermaine?
By all means.
God, I've been making so many notes. There's such great stuff going on here. Fay, what you said about I'm fighting to resist the box is what we hear in your art form and your creative practice as well. And I've seen you perform live, and I said, "Oh my God, that's like Khayal music," And people forget that even Alice Coltrane. I mean, they love fetishizing the story about her spiritual journey. She was a very astute disciple of Hindustani classical music. When she invited the great Shehnai master, Ustad Bismillah Khan, John Coltrane, Pharoah Sanders, and Alice Coltrane, you hear Bismillah Khan in their music. And there's very little understanding of the creative process of Black women. And Faye, once again, with humility, cut me down anytime in this moment here, and I try to understand it, and we are not going to understand what that is until we center our work around these creative practitioners. But also one philosopher that I keep going back to is Bell Hooks. And she talks, she talks about the idea of creating a space of leisure. Yeah, creating a space of leisure where you are allowed to commune with your ideal self, which is always denied to Black women, right? They're always forced into providing a function for society. First of all, it is so important, and Jermaine, that connects back to, when a funder or a patron supports your art, whether you're in Renaissance Italy or here, that's what you get, the gift of space and time. Absolutely, the dollar amount around it is very important, but it's what is in that privilege, and that privilege has always been denied to Black women. And she also talks, and this is her essay, her collective essay on creativity, and forgive me, I'm forgetting the title here, but she talks about that creative space of leisure that's denied to Black women, but also that space and Black women eventually being able to enter that space is an ultimate threat. It's an ultimate threat. So, Black female creativity is ultimately a threat to the oppressive structure out there, which I found to be a pretty profound space to start my work around that and take it. And of course I'm still learning. I occupy an interesting space. There's all this institutional work, program design, managing money. I'm the one who shows up in artists' inboxes with a little stick saying, I need your receipts so I can file them for IRS. How did you spend that money? Which is not the best way artists want to spend their time doing. But so there's that side of me. But and then there's also the side where we have to understand who the artist is on an existential base, right? So when an artist says to me, when we all as organizations come down on artists saying, oh yes, art and social justice. Now we have grants for that. So now complete this application form. And you have an artist who calls you and says, Gargi, I'm a Black man who was drafted in the Vietnam War. I am alive and I am making my music. That alone is a justice. My own existence is political. The fact that I'm still here. So we have to really tread a line of what are we burdening the artists with? And I'm going to be a little cynical here and say that we have to be very careful that we are not driving corporate interests, So when does your diversity, equity, and inclusion interest become a corporate strategy? As Angela Davis has said. And when do they serve the idea that, that A, there has to be a historic course correction. B, this is for the good of society. Equality, equity is for the good of us all. And when is it that we understand that the artist is pushing back? And that's okay too. The artist is resisting. And Fay, your idea of that resistance has got me thinking about that resistance has to walk side by side with us. We always have to embrace artists who are pushing back at us. That's the only way to keep it sound. And just two more points, and I'll wrap my up. And Nabil, with yours, I thought about something Jason Moran said at a talk recently about the idea of Black radio, keeping the airwaves Black, and how in Texas, when he was growing up, that is what they had, that ownership of sound through mass media. But we are also at Chamber Music America asking the question, where are the Black sound engineers now? And that is something we are thinking about. So I'm very grateful you enlisted those organizations that are doing work with youth. I'll definitely follow up with that and explore what else is going on. But once again, that's in there. So I wanted to round it off with, we can talk about all this from theoretical aspects, but something quite terrible happened recently, and I don't think it has landed on us. The composer Daniel Romaine, who was composing for the Tulsa Opera, whose commission was canceled because of one line in his libretto that said, "God damn America." This is the United States of America. We talk about freedom of expression all the time, but what happened to this black artist who was invited to write a commission on the massacre, Tulsa massacre, and because one of his libretto had one of the lines was "God damn America," his commission was canceled. This is a very East Germany Stasi style cultural sort of quelching resistance, and this event just happened. None of the main cultural commentators in the New York Times or the main newspaper had anything to say about this. A Black artist being censored so openly. And so we can talk about things theoretically. We can talk about all the changes we are making as institutions, as funding organizations. But here we have a Black artist who's not even allowed to speak of a massacre of Black people in one line, which is not such a shocking line. God damn America. It's possibly people say this in their homes quite often, and So we have to really understand what happened there and what that means in 2021. We're coming through George Floyd, and are in the art, and this is what I mean, that in the arts world, we are betraying the decay all the time when something like this happens. We're actually we're demonstrating that, we have our own civil rights reckoning to take place in the arts community. We can by no means say that art exists to educate and liberate consciousness, because this kind of mainstream artistic practice it's very, I'm very disturbed by it. It's a very, very dangerous thing that has happened, and that sets precedent. If you can cancel one Black composer, for that, then what does it say for the rest of our commissioned artists? So, I would just, I'm just going to pause here to just think about so much that this wonderful conversation has really brought to the fore.
Thank you so much for that. You really raise a challenge for I think our journalists in particular, because journalists have something to do with what happens when social justice becomes a brand, and when the rules of social justice branding work for almost everybody except the Black person who needs to tell the truth through art. You bring in a very interesting point. I'm curious if we have any response about that particular aspect of social justice, art, and journalism and marketing, the marketing of social justice.
Well, I like to say that, we have allowed white supremacy to appropriate that whole concept of America, because what you mentioned earlier, the latest project I was doing, it's not an album yet, but it will be, an American songbook. Something as simple as an American songbook. We can say that and only assume that it's one type of music, when in fact, if it was truly an American songbook, it's almost an infinite amount of music across the Americas that we have created here. And when you say the word America, what does that really mean? To me, it means the culmination of indigenous and African culture into a uniquely creative culture across the entire hemisphere, because it's like a gigantic jazz republic. Because the thing that makes American music unique among musics of the world, no matter where it comes from, much of it is improvisational, and practically not all of it, but much of it has been the result of a blend of what's great about what has been brought here. And so, I'll just come around and say the fascists, the white supremacist elements that have always traditionally acclaimed that word American, I think we need to claim it beyond just the Coca-Cola commercial. Everybody's part of everything, not that. But what's great about this hemisphere? What is great about it? So when Che Guevara was saying, what about the United States of the Americas? And changing the way we think can counteract that whole, like canceling somebody because they said "goddamn America" can really do a lot to canceling that whole momentum of where it's going. We have to claim what makes this country great is us, and not only do we need to have an equal part of it, but wait a minute, let's look beyond that. This country is great because of, if it wasn't for indigenous people, if it wasn't for Black people, what would we have? I mean, I know there's other influences, but essentially that's what this country is. And I think counteracting that thought, because our thoughts are going to be the thing that changes everything. It's our thoughts. So that's what I thought about that.
Thank you, Mixashawn. I don't know if we have any questions yet from our audience, but I think someone will let us know if there are questions. I'm watching my chat, but until then, let the conversation continue. Here we go. All right. Question in the Q&A from Deidre Rose. And if I mispronounce any person's name, I apologize in advance because I'm catching your name on the fly. This is from Deidre Rose. When Bird came on the scene, bebop was avant-garde. It's now garde. Why isn't avant-garde jazz explained in this context? All right, interesting. Anybody can take a go.
Well, I'll tackle it really quickly from a journalistic standpoint. And I guess this is where I sound like the jaded journalist who's been around maybe for a little bit too long. But I feel that a lot of editors in particular don't they don't have time or space for the explanation. Like, I totally understand and I agree with that question and that sentiment. Like, why aren't we explaining that? But in the spaces where people would have time or interest to learn about those sorts of things, there has to be time, space, and interest from the powers that be to want to explain something like that. And I've found that over the years that yes, you have certain publications that will allow you to go into that history, but by and large, quite frankly, people, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, people just don't, for whatever reason, they just don't have time for that explanation, which I don't agree with, but maybe that's just from my little corner of the earth. That's been sort of the challenges I've been dealing with too.
Thank you.
I don't know if this will answer the question about Charlie Parker, but one of the things I've been thinking a lot during this conversation is the Questlove movie, Summer of Soul, and just in general, just a general erasure of Black culture. And I think about the fact that that movie has been around, that footage has been around for 30 years. And that was a funded festival, and the mayor was behind it, but Woodstock came, and that was, out of the white space. And so the summer of that festival was just ignored, and you do the cultural festival. So, and it just feels like that's sort of the ongoing story within the United States around any Black cultural works. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like, and I would just also add that talking about bebop, bebop came on the scene in the 40s. I'm not so sure why we still need to talk about it unless we're using it as a contextual, a place of context to sort of describe things that are happening today. And I'm not a journalist, but I think that most journalists write about things that are timely. I know as an artist that if I bring out a record and a journalist is probably not even going to want to touch it if it's been out more than a couple of months. There is this sort of energy to kind of be timely and newsworthy of what's of now. So I'm not sure why bebop needs to be discussed right now unless it's contextual in relation to something else that's happening.
Someone also mentioned in the chat that, that's also a very good discussion point for educators. Educators, of course, have a lot to do with how we put in context, how one form interacts with another. Let's see, we've got a comment from William Parker in the chat. He says, culture is the basis of all ideas, images, and actions. To move is to move culturally by a set of values given to you by your culture. Without culture, Blacks are only a set of reactions to white people. And it seems to be a quote attributed to Larry Neal. I think this is a very interesting discussion point for us, that culture is the basis of all ideas. Reminds me, of course, of the root word of culture, which is cult or cultus, which is the movements of worship and activity that form who you are. So what do you all think? Anybody can pick up on this, but without culture, Blacks are only a set of reactions to white people. Very strong statement.
I don't have a comment. I just want to ask, when they say Blacks, without culture, Blacks are only a set of reactions to white people. Black people where?
Location,
I think about this idea about the white gaze, right? We're always responding to the white gaze. We're always a set of reactions to what is, ascribed for us. And I think, not only is it Toni Morrison who beautifully said, they'll spend their entire time telling you you have no culture. So you will spend your entire time proving to them that you have culture. And that cycle needs to be shattered, but also a lot of colonial writing and Edward Said, of course, the wonderful scholar who penned the iconic Orientalism. That question is, of course, picked up there. Is the position of the other constantly contextualized by the white gaze? So that's what I thought of Mr. Parker's quote.
Jordan Davis asks, What artistic or educational efforts do you know of that are actively reconnecting Black youth with their musical and cultural heritage? What artistic or educational efforts do you know of that are actively reconnecting Black youth with their musical and cultural heritage? Excellent question.
I mean, Arts for Art is a really great organization, first of all, but also, disclaimer: Jordan is with Chamber Music America and has recently joined us, and she's a marvelous artist herself, and really an important voice in our own organization. So, one of the things we find is we need to understand how certain communities form their own notions of sustainability and youth development. So, the examples I would give you is Delbert Anderson, what he's doing with the Navajo youth out in New Mexico. He literally built a performance space for jazz. He said these are regions where there is no art whatsoever. There's no funding for it whatsoever. But art is needed. Our youth definitely need it. So that's an example. But we also focus on artists like William Cepeda in Puerto Rico, but also primarily Loíza, which is considered the Little Africa of Puerto Rico. He's an Afro-Rican artist, and he comes from a long lineage of the Cepeda family, that are still using a lot of the indigenous rhythms, a lot of the rhythms that were, brought over from Africa, of course, the bomba plena as well. And so we try to understand, how is it he's been sustaining? And one of the things William has been doing is he has been self-funding the children. Because you have to understand, William did get an honorary doctorate from Berkeley College for the the work that he has for his own legacy. But he comes from that apprentice system, that traditional apprentice system, which jazz is also very much a part of. So for him, investing in the children is a natural extension of his artistic practice. And so we have to pay attention to what's happening at that local level. When I talked about local advocacy, is understanding this and really uplifting these these communities and these artists and community workers. The trumpeter Hannibal Lokumbe recently told us, he said, Gargi, pay attention to this brother out in Camden, New Jersey, where his bands, his middle school and high school students, all day long, they listen to Eric Dolphy. And so, these are these individuals who are definitely doing this work and have been doing it without any institutional support. So, I'm always listening. My ear is always on the ground, but I always also go back to Mr. Harold Mayburn. First time I saw him at the Vanguard, and I introduced myself to him. He said, Gargi, take the funding to the South. He said, you must invest the South. And Chamber Music America has started making those inroads. A lot of our funding is now going to the Deep South and supporting, artistic communities there as well. But we're always listening. But I see some suggestions in the comment boxes.
Thank you. Anyone else know of different organizations that are connecting Black youth with musical and cultural heritage? We can't spread the word about those organizations enough. I think, our silence, speaks volumes about the fact that there are more opportunities. We can say with confidence that there is not an oversaturation of opportunities for Black youth to reconnect through music with cultural heritage. And I think that, of course, everyone on this panel is a part of what that might look like in the future. Mixashawn, are you aware of any?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm from Hartford, and we of course have the Artist Collective, which has helped me, and many kids in when we were younger, to connect with great Black music African music. I know that Hartford has, it's very strange, but I'm just saying the Artist Collective, because that's run by, by Black people like Dahlia McLean, Jack McLean, who passed, the late Jack McLean, Cheryl Smith, who just passed away. But that's the art organization that comes immediately to my mind, because we have, in Hartford, we're very fortunate that we have an institution like that that's been doing it for the last about 40 years. So, I mean, I'll just toot my own horn for my community. We do have funding for that. And it's not just the Artist Collective. I mean, they also have other organizations like in the mainstream school system, CREC. They have the School for Performing Arts, which connects kids with Black music, but they don't really concentrate on the neighborhoods like the Artist Collective does. Or there's a couple of other organizations that come to my mind, but I'm having a senile moment, so don't mind me.
No problem at all. No problem. Okay, for our last section of our conversation, I wanted to ask you something of a constructive and creative question. And so it may take a second. So whoever is the first person to speak will be the person who scatters the seeds of thought for everyone else in a productive way. But I want each of our panelists to imagine a world in which systemic racism and cultural colonization does not exist. So we know that we live in a world where it not only does exist, but absolutely shapes almost every aspect of how Black people experience culture in America. But I want you to imagine a time in the foreseeable future, meaning a time that you can imagine in a practical way, in which systemic racism and cultural colonization is no longer a decisive factor. I'll say it that way. And I want you to describe for me what a day of music would be like. That might be a day of music philanthropy. It may be a celebration of the end of a successful year. That might be a day of going to a concert. That might even be a day of deciding to answer the call to music as a lifestyle, hits someone in the head, and you realize there are institutions for that. But what would that look like for you in a world where systemic racism and cultural colonization either no longer exist or they're not a deciding factor? Maybe it's a day of writing as a journalist. Maybe it's a decision to publish something. But in a positive and creative and engaging way, what would it look like to work in music in a world where systemic racism and cultural colonization are no longer the deciding factors or don't exist at all?
And I have a very surface sort of knee-jerk, and I'm sure people will get deeper, but this is literally a visual because you asked what it would look like, and that's where my brain went. But having just watched Summer of Soul, which I'm sure everyone's seen, which already came up, and then rewatching some Woodstock footage, which of course I've known about and seen since I was a kid. To me, it's less about who's on stage. Obviously, Summer of Soul performers were predominantly Black, and Woodstock largely white, but obviously some big Black artists playing too. But the difference in the audiences was palpable. It was a Black audience and a white audience. And for me, in this scenario, what I would like to see and would hope to see would be something in between, where either of those concerts would be just a more mixed crowd and it wouldn't be so divided.
That's a beautiful vision to me. Nothing superficial about that. Thank you, Nabil.
I think I'm gonna piggyback off of Nabil's comment, because we often talk about music, and I had the same sort of visual where it's like a lot of the frustration that I have sometimes is, pitching and talking about artists who I feel like more people should know about, So I guess for me personally, it would be to that end. It would be, I don't know, a festival or either some sort of performance block where it's just music from everywhere. And I'm not talking just from the United States. Like over the past couple of years, I've been living off and on in Nairobi, Kenya. And they have a great music scene over there. You know, they have a jazz scene. They have all kinds of stuff. And then if you go to Rwanda, same thing. So, you know, in a very sort of surface level, we are the world type of situation, I would love to see a bill where it's like all the indigenous sort of like jazz and music from all these different places in one place with an audience that is just, you know, more so open-minded to what's playing out on stage and not necessarily the name that's on the bill.
Mm.
Yeah, kind of like the Planet Earth All-Stars. Yeah.
Yep.
With me, you know, envisioning that world is like, I mean, I guess cultural festivals are like one, not all powwows, but every now and then you go to a powwow or a cultural gathering, and you're playing that music and you're into it, and you go beyond this capitalist world that we've inherited, and it, you know, because those concepts of, you know, the concept of transactional, as Gargi mentioned, transactional, you know, way that we do music and culture, that didn't exist. And that's when you're playing those indigenous musics, when you're really into it, those are the kinds of things that I imagine. And it's also, even though you're playing ancient music, it's also opening that third eye in you, that creative mind, because I know myself in really delving into indigenous music is how one way that I even learned how to even really sing, because more than half of the gigs I do now are singing. And I'd had no idea I was going to really be a singer until I started doing indigenous music. And then I could, because even singing rock and roll or different types of music, it didn't really open up my voice and my being like that. So I would say it just as Marcus has said, you know, it's like when you're in a cultural place that's connected to an ancient side of things, that automatically just opens you up to that, and all the scenes that come, they come along with it.
I think what I would like to see is sort of infrastructure for artists. I think a lot about residencies. I've done a number of them, and they're predominantly really white spaces. And they're important spaces because that's where you can create work and have infrastructure to have just sort of be ensconced away. So I would like to see, in my ideal world, spaces like that are predominantly Black and maybe a few that are predominantly female, or for non-binary artists, to have spaces to create and talk out process. And I've learned a lot, as an artist being in those spaces. They're really important spaces, and there's too few people of color in them.
Wow. If racism is no longer a problem, then I have to just close my books and go home. But now Jermaine, if racism is done, then Fay and I have to work on the patriarchy. You know, we have to dismantle that. Well, we know they're all interconnected. We know racism is a function of all this interconnectedness. You know, I'd like to point to what Marcus said a little, you know, about celebrating these various art forms informing all, or, you know, rooted in various world heritages and traditions. Chamber Music America just launched a new program called Artistic Project, where we do envision such a space. And Fay, I realize once again, the kind of aesthetic you yearn for is not always understood. But this one, I'll work with you, and we'll get something going for this. But I want to point everybody in the audience also to look up a study at the Center for Urban Studies, which is based in New York City, that did research on immigrant and undocumented artists in New York City. And we're talking about master artists, master kora players, master percussionists, who have either been, you know, refugees, economic refugees, or refugees of war, or, you know, have come in under different circumstances to this country. So, you know, we have spaces like Carnegie Hall or the Lincoln Center, where, you know, we have these gradations of where white classical artists belong and how they should be revered, where Black artists belong. And then these sort of immigrant artists, once again, master artists from their own countries, they often have, and these are facts in the study, that they're digging graves in Queens to make a living, right? So again, we go back to that question: who gets to practice this art? Who gets to practice their art form? And who gets to practice it in an unencumbered manner? So if we say it's okay for one artist to, you know, drive a cab or dig a grave, and you know, there is dignity in labor, there's nothing wrong with these jobs, they're an honest living, but forcing an artist to have to do this rather than what they are doing, and bringing generations of heritage in their artwork, right? So now Chamber of Music America's artistic projects is making very dedicated outreach to these artists as well, to say that we have to revere, we have to create that platform for our artists to exist, an equal amount of money to be invested in their work. But everything Fay has said and Nabil has said it is possible from an institutional point of view. It takes time, but it is possible, and it is, you know, you've given me some direction to work on. To, you know, Fay, we'll really connect for artistic projects, because that is a deadline is coming up. and Mixashawn, I'm so happy to hear you're in Hartford, because I'm your neighbor. I've recently moved there, and I would love to learn more. Of course, I know about Mr. McLean's legacy here, but how it is Chamber of Music America can start creating a pipeline to, you know, bring in some programming funding as well, if at all you're seeking that. Because
for sure.
But you know, what would a world look like if we were able to solve a lot of these problems we take on at the moment? It would be artistic practice in our national consciousness, not in a way where we say, teach your child how to play music because they'll get better at math. No. Yeah. Artistic practice is good for the self. It's a way of us developing and forming our identities as a people. So that national consciousness about art, you know, there's still a debate. I'm pretty sure this group of artists, there's still a debate whether jazz is an American art form. You know, there's still the debate out there about this, which is it's very disturbing to encounter. And you know, the other problem also is very unique to the United States is, and I see this in my work as we collect data. You know, we collect racial data of where artists are coming from and how much money is being invested in artists of color. An active resistance to white artists actively resist identifying themselves as white. I also frequently receive emails where, you know, white artists will say, I've been playing jazz for 40 years. I don't identify as white anymore. This is a unique psychosis in this society. It's a unique psychosis in this society. So, you know, we have to, will white supremacy ever cease to be? I'm too close to the problems, Jermaine, to imagine a freer time. But I think all the suggestions our artists here are talking about, and everything Nabil and Marcus are talking about, are possibilities that we can work on, and we can definitely. And I want to leave you all also with an assurance that these conversations are having at funder levels. You know, in the history of the United States, this is the first time we see major funders like the Duke Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation. The leaders are Black leaders in this space. In Duke, predominantly in the art space. It has allowed us to have different conversations about arts funding. It has allowed us to even say the words white supremacy in funder spaces. So, you know, from where I sit, yes, I'm too close to the problems, but I'm also close enough to the solutions to say things are possible.
It seems like proximity to the problem is a great place to be, because it puts you at the forefront of living the solution. I like how Patricia just put it in the chat, that the time in which we will be able to have music free of systemic racism and cultural colonization will look like African Americans knowing the history of music that is an African American music, and that there will be a way to imagine that you can make a living as an artist and be supported by people who look like you. So rather than putting anyone out of a job, it just looks like it will expand the philanthropy world, and it'll expand the possibilities of the journalist world, and it'll create new spaces of freedom and possibility for artists to do what we all need artists to do, which is to help us materialize what the process of freedom looks like. So Marcus and Gargi and Fay and Mixashawn and Nabil, thank you so much for an enriching and enlivening conversation. And we hope that everyone will enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
See you all.